I mean, effectively, we've all been looking for a saviour to resolve the queue, but it keeps being a different saviour than the one we thought it was going to be.
That's also this kind of element of time, so if you do something which is quite radical and it's going to have a big impact, but it takes a really long time to implement, the queue carries on growing in the meantime. So that in itself can be a bit self-defeating.
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Road Night Taylor's The Connectology podcast. I'm joined today by Nikki Pillinger and Catherine Cleary. So welcome both.
Hi, Pete.
Hi, Pete.
There's been absolutely loads going on in the connection space over the last couple of years, and it's time to perhaps draw breath and have a look back. It's very easy to get caught up in the moment with everything that's going on right now with connections reform, but there's been an absolute load that's gone on in the last couple of years that I think was just worth reflecting on, seeing if any of them have actually done anything useful, looking at the impact of them, and then we're going to spend a few minutes at the end just looking at what's coming next and to see if we can set the scene for the rest of 2024 and into 2025. The first thing that we want to pick up on and go over to Nikki for this, can you just talk us through the growth of applications and especially the growth of the transmission queue over the last couple of years, because that's really what's driven a lot of the issues.
Yes, of course. So this kind of goes back a little way, really. So during the days of when we had subsidies, we had quite small distributed generation. So a lot of it would be sort of 11 or 33 kV connected and maybe 5-10 megawatts, not too big. Then after the subsidies ended, developers sort of started looking at larger projects. So a lot of like 50 megawatt projects at 132 kV. This actually then started to fill up the distribution system quite quickly. At the end of the subsidies, distribution customers started looking at much larger connections to make connections viable. Subsidies ended in 2017 and started looking at sort of larger projects like 50 megawatts at 132 was quite a popular application. And this actually then started to fill up the distribution system quite quickly. So from about 2020 onwards, people then started getting mod-up results back that were coming back with what we then thought was quite ridiculous dates. 2028 actually sounds like quite a reasonable connection date nowadays. And people are also setting their sights on transmission connections as well to get even more economies of scale. However, what this did was it filled up the distribution system quite quickly. So people would start getting quite a lot of transmission reinforcement, quite a lot of A&M associated with their connection. So people then started going straight to the transmission system to apply. And this caused a kind of an explosion that it was quite unprecedented in terms of applications and in terms of contracted capacity. So I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but last look, it was about 700 gigawatts of contracted connections in the queue. There's about 150, 160 gigawatts of distribution connections. Last official sort of figures I heard from solar and storage were that we had 5 times more solar, 5 times more storage than we actually needed to get to net zero by 2050. So a huge amount of distributed generation. So this is kind of the problem that we have at the moment, is that we don't need all of this contracted generation, yet we have a system that we have to run or design as if this generation is going to go ahead. So this is what connections reform is trying to tackle now, and this is what a few other initiatives sort of a little while back tried to look at and solve.
Thanks, Nikki. And Catherine, just to bring you in, because you've probably been doing transmission applications longer than any of the rest of us have in Road Night Taylor. So what was life like in the transmission space prior to this explosion of transmission applications sort of 3 or so years ago?
The tech queue was probably maybe less than 200 gigawatts back then. And I suppose the important point was it wasn't growing super rapidly. So we used to see about 100 to 300 offers per TO, so across NGET and the 2 Scottish TOs come out per year. That has changed significantly, and we're now that's multiplied by a factor of at least 10, I believe, in total, sort of since about kind of 2021, 2022. the kind of volume of offers being released has exponentially increased, and that obviously has driven the increase in the contracted capacity that Nikki mentioned there as well.
I think it's often quite easy to point the finger at the ESO and the TOs and sort of criticize on processes and so on. It has been a really significant step change in what they were used to, wasn't it?
Exactly. I think the other point is probably that those applications came from a very small pool of customers. You could get all of the companies in one room, who have existing energized transmission connections and we're kind of used to applying for transmission connections. So effectively the ESO saw a huge growth in customers, but from entirely new customers, as Nikki said, a lot of parties who had been used to looking at kind of embedded schemes, distribution schemes, solar storage schemes, who had no experience of the ESO connections. I think that's a challenge for anyone to face.
Building on from that, there's the issue of educating a whole new group of developers, isn't there, in terms of how transmission applications work.
Educating them and also deciding how you're going to engage. And I think that's probably one of the things which has been the biggest shift, is a need to perhaps formalize some of the policy which were effectively kind of bilateral discussions in the old days. And there wasn't quite so much concern around, are you treating everyone, absolutely uniformly, because it was recognized, that perhaps one nuclear power station wasn't the same as an offshore wind farm. There wasn't that kind of same element of a bulk level of applications or interests from comparable parties, like we are now seeing, with storage contracts in particular, or solar contracts. There are now lots and lots of projects that look the same, and therefore there's a need to treat people equally.
And at distribution, Nikki, what sort of things have the distribution customers had to learn as well? Because I guess in the past, distribution customers didn't always think that there was a transmission network. They didn't even need to know that there was a transmission network somewhere above the GSP. But how's that changed over the last couple of years?
So that's changed hugely, actually. And certainly when I started doing this, going through what we called the statement of works process was quite a standard thing that you did. The DNO would send off an application to National Grid. National Grid would come back and say, yeah, that's okay. You can go ahead and you can connect. Over the last 3 or 4 years or so, we've had very different responses. So distribution customers have had to get used to not only much longer connection timescales, but also a very different cost impact. So if you have a transmission impact assessment that comes back with a new supergrid transformer, which is something we've spoken about quite a lot, the distribution customer may have to pay for either all or part of that, depending on how many people are in that MODAP queue and how many people stay in that MODAP queue. Also, securities and liabilities have got exponentially higher. So projects would have ordinarily just had sort of wider liabilities and securities that would kick in at their trigger date, whereas now they've got quite a lot of attributable securities and liabilities, which can be really, really high. These can run up into the millions of pounds. So very much a step change in terms of quite early liabilities, but financial liabilities for projects.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. Yeah, and I don't think it's just developers that have had to learn, because I think from a distribution point of view, lots more people, employees in the distribution companies, have had to learn about transmission processes. So previously, if you were an 11 kV connection engineer, you probably wouldn't have had to talk to any of your direct customers about the transmission system. But now, as an 11 kV planner, you're briefing your own customers who are installing, 2, 3, 4 megawatt generation schemes, and you're briefing them around the project progression process. So there's been a lot of learning within the distribution networks and lots of learning within the transmission companies as well, because they're now having to learn a lot more about the distribution system because distribution customers are impacting on them. So yeah, I think there's just been a whole lot of learning across the industry, and I guess change always feels a little bit haphazard at times, and it's probably been so. But I feel like people are starting to get to a place where everyone knows reasonably well what the deal is at the moment. I don't know if you agree.
I was going to say,
to be honest, there's a lot of stuff that's still not actually written down. Like I said, with the supergrid transformer charging, there is a working group looking at that at the moment, but it's by no means uniform as to how those charges are administered or how they are securitized or treated by the DNOs.
Catherine,
And I
you were going
suppose
to
there's
say?
been a level of caution, possibly, like, almost a bit of a cautionary learning exercise from generation and how quickly it did snowball peaks, in terms of every type of generation, really from a megawatt upwards being classed as significant. And that learning or that caution now possibly being applied to demand, which is perhaps an overreaction. But I suppose the concern from a DNO's perspective is I don't want to repeat the potential errors of the past in terms of sort of, waving lots of things through and then turning around and realizing we have a big transmission demand constraint. And so perhaps sort of seeing people being more cautious from a demand perspective as well.
Interesting. I can remember a senior manager where I used to work when the solar rush first started, who said, "It's okay, this is just a bump. We'll go back to normal next year." And of course, the bump turned into an enormous, great step change that has continued to get bigger for the last 10 or so years. So it's, I think sometimes the industry has been guilty of over-optimistic thinking and then potentially on the other flip side, being overly pessimistic as well. So moving on from just the sort of growth in the queue, let's just pick up on significant code review. So, Catherine, I don't know if you could very briefly outline what the significant code review was. So it came into force April 2023. So
which seems like a really long time ago, but is actually only a year and a half ago. And I think we thought this would be the big news story, didn't we? And we'd all be talking about this for ages, and then other things have come and supplanted it. But effectively, that looked at changing the charging boundaries for customers connecting to the DNO's networks, so for distribution customers. It removed reinforcement charges for demand customers. So, that was that was sold as being quite a big positive story as making the charging arrangements shallower for distribution customers. For generation schemes at distribution, it just limited your reinforcement charges, didn't it? So effectively to the kind of voltage level where you were connecting. And it also explicitly put an onus on the DNOs to consider A&M solutions. So they couldn't just sort of say, oh no, we're just going to do this bit of reinforcement. They had to consider flexible solutions and set out some more kind of standardized terminology, I suppose, that we use, and actually a standardized methodology for assessing constraint as a result of A&M, which is the dreaded spreadsheet, Pete.
Yes, I think we have to mention the dreaded DCP 404 spreadsheet. Those of you who are familiar with this will also find it terrible. I think the outcome of that was trying to implement something that was common across all the DNOs for assessing curtailment. And it feels like they just went to the lowest common denominator of what could be achieved.
And that was really quite low.
In a really short time scale. And it came out with something that was really quite awful. Very clunky assumptions, just couldn't take into account more than one constraint point and all sorts of things like this. So we have been lumped with that over the last 18 months, but I believe that there are some conversations now going on with different DNOs trying to improve on this.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think possibly all the things we're going to talk about, the SCR is perhaps the thing where the impact of it a year and a half on is perhaps most different to what we would have envisaged, in that I think we probably thought there was going to need to be there might be a kind of, significant shift in people's behavior and quite a lot of trying to sort of game the system around SCR charging. We haven't really seen that, partly because I think actually there's probably a reasonable amount of firm pushback from a DNO against trying to kind of game the system. So that would be maybe, applying to try and get a lower voltage point of connection and then, later coming back and increasing your capacity and so on. I guess the complexity of things like the transmission impacts that Nikki's talked about and stuff has meant that gaming isn't really a pragmatic way to go. The applicant would potentially be at a disadvantage anyway, because they might have their transmission impact assessment in two clumps or something like that. So all of that, I think, there's been less of that kind of potential downside. The upside, I think it is worth saying that, because before that point, there was a really piecemeal approach to whether or not A&M could be considered. And I guess it's not that many years ago where, you might have applied to some, quite a lot of the network operators, and they just simply said, no, I'm sorry, we can't offer you an A&M connection. We haven't rolled out A&M in that zone yet. So I think that's probably quite a big win that we've maybe just taken for granted now, is that actually A&M is basically offered across the board, pretty much across the board. Might touch on ENW at some point, but it is coming for a number of reasons. The SCR being the first, and then probably tech limits and things which we'll come on to, have just kind of added to that emphasis. And I think from the awfulness of the standardized spreadsheets has perhaps come, maybe that's given even more weight to the fact that this needed more industry attention. What is the best way for a DNO to share data regarding potential future curtailment? And Nikki, I think you've probably seen more than me, but that it does feel like now we are getting progress from DNOs in publishing better methodologies, sharing far more data publicly.
Yes, very much so. As you said, it's been quite piecemeal with the DNOs. Some of the, the southern DNOs, they had the renewables revolution sort of first. So they've almost had to deal with that sort of active network management capability before some of the other DNOs. However, we are seeing much more transparency in data because A&M is such a big risk and it is so uncertain. People want as good evidence as they can do to show what that might actually turn out like for their project. So most DNOs now have something called an open data portal or something of that name. Some of the DNOs are doing their own curtailment reports and offering their own curtailment reports, whereas some other DNOs, the onus is still on developers to ask them for the data and get their own curtailment report. Quite a lot of the time, people will do their own curtailment reports anyway, but the DNOs are making much more of that network data available.
And those open data portals are actually quite good, aren't they? Most of them, I think, have been sort of developed by the same software provider, so they look quite similar, and it's getting easier to kind of find your way around them and find some really quite useful data. I was pretty overjoyed to discover on UKPNs that actually they publish a full list of all of their EHV outage works, both like recent and planned. Sadly, they don't actually name the circuit something that is publicly accessible, but one step at a time.
They do. UKPN have been very good actually at engaging with customers. They've done a great many workshop sessions, some of which Road Night has been involved in terms of what customers need and what data they can and sort of should to make accessible to customers to do their own curtailment assessments. They're also going to have a self-serve curtailment tool soon, which will be really interesting to see. I think that's potentially coming out at the end of the year.
I agree with you, Catherine, that we thought probably the charging element was going to be the big one, and maybe either customers or DNOs would do some gaming. But actually, it's probably been the A&M bit that's probably been more significant. But actually, having said that, I've been working with a few clients who've definitely benefited from SCR charging rules, especially some demand customers who had like a previous offer in the year before SCR was introduced. Then the new offer they get is significantly cheaper with SCR coming in. So there's definitely been some improvements for some customers, which on the charging side of things, which is good. But I think the other thing that worth picking up, and this is what Nikki was mentioning a bit earlier, is that transmission charges aren't impacted by SCR at all, and we are seeing now more transmission-related charges being put onto distribution customers through, for example, supergrid transformer reinforcements. That's the main issue of charging from the transmission point of view, and so that can be very significant, and the SCR didn't address that at all. Could have done, but sort of chose not to, kicked it into the long grass.
Yeah, bit of a missed opportunity.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on from SCR. So we'll pick up on now National Grid ESO's 5-step plan. So as the transmission queue is rapidly growing, Feb 2023, National Grid ESO issued their now famous, maybe infamous 5-step plan. So Catherine, if you could very briefly sort of touch on some of the points. I'm not going to ask you to list all 5 absolutely without looking, but just generally speaking.
Well, we did think, could we name the 5 points of the 5-point plan? I think looking retrospectively, it's not perhaps, a lot of them have merged into one. So I think maybe it's a 2.5-point plan. But so there was a tech amnesty initially, which was kind of, perhaps the first sort of public statement of, look, we need to start trying to clear out the queue.
Which wasn't spectacularly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the ESO would claim that was successful, but in the grand scheme of things, they got rid of 8 gigawatts in the end, which in the old days would have been quite impressive on a sort of, 150 gigawatt queue, but in the kind of current climate doesn't really make any difference. So a bit of a kind of political move as opposed to anything which had any impact, I think. The revised CPAs, so this was kind of part of what triggered what was then termed the Transmission Works Review, and that had the potential to be really significant and sort of still does. I mean, the big one was the idea that we would set batteries to kind of a grid neutral position when the ESO and TOs did their modelling, and also the idea that the CPAs should include attrition rates, so we shouldn't assume that everyone who's in the queue will go ahead and build. And they were quite ambitious, so that the proposed CPAs assumed that 2/3 of projects wouldn't go ahead and build. So you got rid of 2/3 of the queue.
That is significant, isn't it?
It is really significant compared to the old way of modelling. I think there was a slight caveat in that it was 50% in like the local area to where the generation was connecting, but 2/3 everywhere else. I know this because I did go back and look at some of the slides. When this was first proposed, the proposal was that it would include embedded generation as well. So we would knock out 2/3 of the embedded queues, which would have had a really big impact on, are we triggering new SGTs and things like that. And I think, that was obviously the start of a conversation, but not the end of it. So there were kind of a couple of things, weren't there? That firstly, that the Scottish TOs pushed back quite a lot on those CPAs, initially didn't adopt them. There was, a long protracted conversation about what the right CPAs were. And as a result, we had this sort of situation where the Transmission Works Review ran ahead in England, but behind in Scotland by quite a long way. And I think it's worth saying that the final CPAs that have been used for the Transmission Works Review have never been published. So although we know what the sort of starting point was, I think it was clear that there was an element of pushback as to whether, is that 2/3 acceptable? And also, from a technical perspective, how is that actually administered? Are we taking all of the generators and knocking away 2/3 of their tech? Are we knocking away 2/3 of the generators entirely? Because that's a very, you've got a 150 kV circuit in Scotland and you've got, 2 people who are connecting to T onto it. It makes a big difference if you're taking one of them away or if you're just halving their capacities. I think the granularity of that was a big challenge, and it's still going. That's really important. The Transmission Works Review hasn't completed. So although the 5-point plan feels like a long time ago, actually we haven't got to the conclusion of 2 of its really main points yet.
And I also don't think that did include embedded generation, or we at least haven't been told that it has done.
No, it was meant to, originally.
Yeah, we thought it might make a difference to, the amount of supergrid transformers that were being triggered, because now that 2-step offer process has concluded, pretty much the result of that for most people is you need a new GSP and we don't know where it's going to go.
Yes, well, of course, because the Transmission Works Review triggered the 2-step offer process, didn't it? That was basically the NGET, actually, saying as a TO, saying, hang on a moment, if we need to go back through and do this entire Transmission Works Review process, you sort of need to give us a bit of time off from doing normal connection offers. So is that one of your next points, Pete?
Yeah, I was going to say, because I think my note here says that kicked off in April 23, the 2-step offer process, and was due to end in February of this year, but got extended by a further 3 months, didn't it, to end of May this year. So there was just over a year's worth of sort of 2-step offer review process where customers would get this sort of holding first step offer and then a final 2-step offer. And during that, so during like the second half of last year particularly, there was quite a lot of hope to start with, wasn't there, that these revised CPAs and so on, this was going to be it. People were going to get offers with significantly reduced connection dates.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think, I think we shared, a bit of optimism there that, that effectively those step 1 offers would be a kind of worst case perspective. And that once you did start to take into account, really significant changes in CPAs, taking out 2/3 of the queue, that would remove the need for transmission works. And so the Transmission Works Review would cull the long list of transmission reinforcements proposed. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, actually, it was probably after about the first 6 months of that, what ended up being a 15-month period, the warning signs were probably in the volume of applications. That 2-step offer process didn't really deter people from applying. They could accept a step 1 offer with no liabilities, so there was almost kind of no skin in the game. So the queue kept growing at about sort of 25 to 30 gigawatts per, every sort of every month or every couple of months, I think. And so I suppose what we did was we grew the queue in that interim 2-step offer process far more than we stripped out reinforcement works. So actually, the idea of saying, well, we're going to give everyone worst case offers based on the terrible kind of list of transmission reinforcement projects that we'd identified already in April 2023, and that's clearly not going to get any worse. Actually, that was a, that wasn't a great
and I think as well that everyone was getting pretty similar step one offers, but actually the reality was there was no study work or any assessment really done for those step one offers, and quite a few offers got significantly worse after getting the step two offer back, didn't they?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of them have just been, you need a new GSP, and we don't know where this is going to go, and we hope that connections reform is going to solve this.
Well,
and
Nikki,
a lot of distribution customers haven't actually heard.
I was about to say, distribution customers are lagging behind this.
About what their result is. Yeah,
because it was the two-step offers included project progressions as well, didn't they?
Yeah.
But I guess if the DNOs didn't get their project progression step two offer until May of this year, some of them still trying to work through that and reissue variations to customers.
Yeah, and some of them were even retracted. Do you remember they were withdrawn by the ESO? So that was sort of over some of the concerns around some of the technical assumptions. So yeah, definitely like a long lag. And I think that point about the fact that the reason that the step two offers didn't improve people's connection dates is that they were, the step one offer was based on what everyone had assumed was a worst case scenario back in April 2023 as a kind of fixed snapshot in time. Even if you applied 9 months after that, as you say, Pete, no one was doing any more study work. And at that point, actually, another 200, 300 gigawatts had joined the queue. So it was no longer remotely plausible that you were still going to get that step one date, even if you took out, 2/3 of the queue.
I mean, effectively, we've all been looking for a saviour to resolve the queue, but it keeps being a different saviour than the one we thought it was going to be.
That's also this kind of element of time, so if you do something which is quite radical and it's going to have a big impact, but it takes a really long time to implement, the queue carries on growing in the meantime. So that in itself can be a bit self-defeating.
Hi, I hope you're really enjoying this episode so far and are gaining a lot of very useful insight. If you're a new listener, I hope that you'll feel like you might come back. If so, make sure you hit the follow button and feel free to sign up to our newsletter, The Connectologist, at roadnighttaylor.co.uk so you don't miss out on any of the podcast webinars, case studies, thought pieces and explainers.
So what else was there in the 5-point plan? I think there was something around non-firm connections for storage, wasn't there? To try and accelerate some storage connections. Has that really happened, or has that got all caught up in the whole step two offer issues that we were just talking about?
So the ESO would absolutely say it has happened, and it has happened. There are a small number of storage projects which got accelerated offers. So there were a few winners, but I think it was 10 gigawatts worth of projects, which might have been about 20 individual projects. Yeah. That was batch one. So in theory, this work is still ongoing. I think in practice, perhaps the industry's lost a bit of confidence that it's going to really kind of happen this side of connections reform, and therefore it'll probably get kind of rolled up in some of the connections reform gate 1, gate 2 discussions of next year. So that one, again, I think, so non-firm offers for battery storage, which were basically saying you can ask for an earlier non-firm connection date once your basic kind of core enabling works are done. So if there's a substation and there's a bay that you're connecting into, but if you don't have to wait for the wider reinforcement works to be done, or your enabling works which are non-critical. So if you had an enabling work which was a circuit upgrade, so that could have impacted lots of people, but actually it's basically been sort of sorted through in tranches, and only the first tranche, which came out a while ago now, I think sort of around December last year, January this year, so about sort of 9 months ago. So it has been radio silence on that one for a while.
And then sort of rolled up into the 5-point plan were queue management milestones.
Yeah, or sort of working in parallel. Yes. They kind of came out.
Felt like it was going at the same time anyway.
Yeah, going at the same time, but perhaps a slightly sort of distinct process, because that was following the CUSCMOD process, whereas the 5-point plan initiatives were a bit more things within the ESO's control. without going through a custom mod.
And with so they are now implemented and they're in offers and so on. But I guess with the offers I've seen, everyone's sort of a bit like, well, we're still waiting to see what's going to happen with connections reform. So maybe these milestones that I've got aren't so important at the moment.
And the milestones were backwards looking, or in the rather than forwards looking, which has been the whole discussion point really ever since they were implemented. Is do they actually have any impact soon enough? Because if everyone's got quite late connection dates and you don't have any milestones, but before you get to kind of 5 years before your connection date, then actually you've got sort of 2/3 of the queue who didn't have any milestones until you got to kind of like the late 2020s or 2030. So right from day one, as soon as they were implemented, there was quite a lot of skepticism as to whether they would have any impact soon enough. But they did, because I guess the penalty of missing a milestone under that CUSC mod is now very severe. It is a termination, a potentially automatic termination if you miss one of the first 3 milestones. So that in itself did have a bit of an impact, because the ESO said, we're going to give everyone a window to mod app once if you want to change those milestones, if you think that you're at risk. And so that probably did generate a bit of kind of thought and interest, and also generated a fair few number of mod apps for the ESO to deal with. So I guess that's quite an important point, because that window for those mod apps being submitted only closed earlier this summer, didn't it? That was May 2024 as well.
Yeah. And then the other thing on the 5-point plan, ESO's 5-point plan, there were a few tactical solutions sort of knocking around along with the 5-point plan, which I think have probably mostly got tied up with connections reform. So there was the implementation of a letter of authority for making an application.
That's been implemented, but it's kind of letter of authority. So you need a letter of authority now to submit a transition application, so that's good. But it's still kind of letter of authority version 1, as the ESO would call it. So it's not particularly sophisticated in the sense that there's not necessarily, to go alongside that kind of here's my land, there isn't the same concept of a kind of material change at transmission. So actually at the moment, there's not very much to bind you to that land. You could, what happens if you apply with one land parcel and then move the project? So what happens if you apply with the same land parcel as someone else? So kind of checking for duplicates. All of that has been bundled into what was going to be sort of LOA version 2, which is now part of connections reform.
Yeah. And was there something then around also sort of technology change, allowable changes for different technology types? So can you apply as a solar and then change to a wind farm or something? Has anything like that come out yet?
Yeah, I think on the ESOs, they had a kind of snake diagram that people probably seen at conferences, which was tactical initiatives that were going to be implemented kind of prior to connections reform. So these were kind of like smaller bite-sized chunks of things they could change more easily. And one of those was basically publishing a policy paper on what was a material change or allowable change. And the other was regarding like new applications. So I think that was those have been split out for a while, but basically saying, what are you allowed to do as part of a mod app and what do you have to submit a brand new application for? As I understand, neither of those papers have been published. And although there is quite a lot of work going on, or had been quite a lot of work going on, Laura Henry had led lots of that work at the ESO. I think now it sounds like that is effectively going to get wrapped into connections reform.
Yep. Okay. Brilliant. So that was the 5-point plan, which was published Feb 23. I think it was a few months after the publication of the ESO's 5-point plan that the ENA either coordinated or they just thought they had to do one themselves, issued their own 3-step plan, one of which was effectively sort of transmission distribution interface, which was effectively technical limits. So, Nikki, I don't know if you want to briefly talk us through sort of the tech limits rollout, maybe very briefly what it is, how it's been going.
So, tech limits was a scheme that effectively, the idea of it was to allow people who were ready to connect to the distribution system. This was a little bit of a misnomer in that anyone that had a 2028 or 2030 connection date would not be really in any way ready to connect, because that wouldn't have been a particularly reasonable expectation. So initially it was, people who had got planning, people who had got land, people who had gone through some sort of engineering design, which of course you would not have done if you couldn't connect to a project for several years. So what technical limits turned into was a scheme that people could apply to the DNO for an earlier but constrained connection. This was enabled by the DNO applying to National Grid and saying what capacity is unconnected and sort of unutilized as yet at this GSP. So technical limits has been administered by all of the DNOs. It's been administered slightly differently by all of the DNOs. ENWL has a very different approach to the curtailment, which is a sort of a shared curtailment, which they may well be reevaluating due to that being a very risky tactic for developers, because essentially you've got unlimited potential curtailment. So technical limits has kind of sort of benefited quite a few generators. It does, however, add a massive element of risk into a project, in that you don't know how many projects ahead of you are going to connect, and you may already have A&M on a project anyway. So technical limits, it will last until the transmission reinforcement is completed. So say you have transmission reinforcement that's due to be completed in 2032. When you connect, you will have that curtailment until 2032 when the transmission reinforcement is completed, and then you will have your sort of connection as that would have looked like beforehand. So it's a really positive scheme for some projects. Like I said, quite a large element of risk, especially for projects that are much lower down the queue, because you don't know how many people ahead of you are going to connect, and there's a lot more sort of risks in terms of network configuration, network behavior at that point. But it's been positive for some projects.
I know that when the first sort of technical limits offers came out, and obviously we talked about the fact that things like technical limits just allows you to connect earlier. It doesn't remove the need for you to pay for things like connection assets, so SGT, new SGTs and things. A lot of people said, "Well, can I just have my constrained connection forever?" And that sort of seems to have caused a lot of consternation with people saying, "Oh, that wasn't what technical limits was designed for." Have we got to an answer on that yet? Can people just opt for a constrained connection forever where they don't think it makes any economic sense to, build a new GSP or something like that?
That question is asked on, I think, almost every technical limits webinar that I go on to. And unfortunately, there hasn't been an answer for it yet. The thing with tech limits was that it was the idea of it was that it could be administered quite quickly and to all GSPs. In reality, technical limits doesn't work for quite a few GSPs across the country. Works quite well where you've just got a thermal constraint because you can manage that via A&M. Doesn't work where you have a fault level constraint particularly. In fact, I haven't seen any technical limits offers for sites with fault level constraints yet. They may have been offered out, but I haven't seen any to sort of know how that fault level constraint is being dealt with under technical limits.
I think the way they were
infrastructure sites as well.
I think the way they were doing the fault level ones, Nikki, was they were going back to doing a reevaluation of the fault level at the site and going, is there anyone we can squeeze in up to the fault level headroom? And if they could squeeze someone into the fault level headroom, then they put them on the A&M, the thermal issues. But anyone who definitely was outside of the sort of fault level rating, I think it was just, you've just got to wait for the reinforcement works. I think that's the way it was handled.
Yeah, so challenging on sites with fault level issues, both at distribution and transmission. Also, just a sort of a word of warning, there are I've seen some DNO offers that have said you can have an earlier connection date, but those DNO offers haven't actually incorporated any works the DNO has to do or any sort of costs for anything that the DNO has to do. So be very, very wary of technical limits offers because sometimes they're absolutely not telling you the whole story.
And of course, our old friend, the DCP 404 curtailment spreadsheet rears its ugly head again, and because that's how most of the technical limits sort of predicted curtailment was being calculated and passed out to customers as well, which certainly led to some very or potentially high levels of curtailment, or at least very unrealistic levels being presented to customers. So anyway, that was technical limits, and so that's there. It's the thing. It's going on potentially for some customers. It will prove to be useful. So then under the 3-step plan, there was a couple of other bits. There was some tactical solutions for batteries, which
Yeah.
I don't
Do you
know
remember
if
what they were, Pete?
I do actually, because I did a little bit of a review on these. So one of them was effectively mandating that storage connections will be non-firm. So all the DNOs now will issue every battery offer as non-firm, and you get some really interesting interpretations of what that means. So I've seen
So not
some,
P26 compliant would sort of be the
so
one extreme definition, and presumably
Yeah.
A&M would be the other.
Well, I think the way that they've tend to have interpreted non-firm is you are basically able to be tripped and will be tripped out for any outage on the system. So
Which is really what we would have referred to as single circuit risk, which 99.9% of those connection offers would have been in the first place.
But what I've seen it, Catherine, has come out like, so for one battery connection I was involved with, it was connected effectively a tee-off or looping connection to a 132 kV circuit. So obviously for loss of the circuit they're connected to, and it was just a radial feed to a transformer. So you lose that circuit, you lose the battery system. I don't think anyone would have batted an eyelid at that. But it was also going to be intertripped for an outage of the other circuit down to the BSV. So, that was like sort of belt and braces. Well, we're definitely going to trip you off. Not at some point in the future, we might need to trip you off for this outage if we don't have sufficient capacity or something like that. It was just, we're just going to trip you off because you must be non-firm, and therefore we'll trip you off for everything. And then I've seen batteries coming in just as A&M without any caveats. It's just, you will have A&M for anything that we feel that we want to give you A&M for. So I think it's been applied quite broadly. I think that one. It's probably a good thing, but maybe just needs some careful consideration of what the offers look like when they come out. And then the other one was putting some commentary around P2 and basically applying diversity to non-flexible battery customers' schemes that had already been accepted. So there's a whole queue in the distribution systems of battery schemes that don't have these non-firm arrangements. So what do you do with them? So it was applying a level of diversity to those, not particularly, high levels of diversity. Yeah. So
not a huge impact.
Probably not going to help that much, I don't think, was my initial thoughts.
And the sort of third kind of problem area, I would have said, for batteries at distribution from a kind of ENA standards perspective was the P28 issues for batteries, and some DNOs being very concerned about instantaneous step changes or kind of coincident step changes from batteries. And the ENA 3-step plan didn't talk about that, I don't think, Pete.
No, not at all. But I do think that there would be some reasonable weight to say, if you have to apply diversity for demand security, like on a P2 basis for just considering load, apply the same level of diversity at the very least when considering P28 for step change.
Yeah.
But I don't know anyone that's actually picked that up yet.
Yeah, I've still seen a few offers coming out from some of the northern DNOs with some quite kind of, either pessimistic or perhaps just very difficult to interpret P28 restrictions on batteries. So I think it's definitely still an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, three-step plans definitely had its own impact as well. So moving on, we are very quickly running out of time. Connections reform. Now, we've already said a lot about connections reform on webinars and podcasts, so we're not going to say very much, apart from maybe to very quickly sketch out the timeline, the history.
I suppose because connections reform actually did run basically in parallel with some of these things. So we had connections reform. There was a kind of industry consultation on the ideas behind connections reform. It didn't really set out any kind of clear straw man proposals, but it ended in a document which the ESO called their final recommendations. And I think in some ways, the reason for pulling this out, Pete, I think, is that perhaps that consultation got a lot more wider interest, perhaps, than now. Connections reform is in the kind of code mods territory, so the CUSP mods and kind of code working panels. It feels like a very sort of transmission, geeky, kind of legally piece of work, whereas the kind of initial sort of consultation was more of a kind of, what do you think about the following ideas? But it's changed a lot, hasn't it? So the kind of actual technical proposals within connections reform are really quite radically different to what was outlined in the ESO's final recommendations paper. And so, yeah, I think that's probably just a nod to the fact that in the course of about 9 months between November 2023 when that final recommendations paper came out, and when we just this summer had that consultation on the current code mods, there's a really big difference in what's being proposed. And I think given the number of the work groups have had back the consultation responses, and they've had about 60 to 80 responses for each of the code modifications, so CMP 434 and 435. I guess given the number of those and the ESO's comments already, we're expecting changes again. So connections reform is basically just constantly in flight.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth saying connections reform was due to be rolled out January 2025. That's now being pushed back to later on in the spring.
Yeah, I think there's still we're waiting for the public announcement on that, but that seems to be the kind of indications that have gone to the working group, is that.
And I think it's also worth picking up on that already there's now lots of talk around sort of additions to connections reform or further strengthening of it required, because there was a request for information, wasn't there, done by the ESO along the lines of if we were to roll out this process, what would sort of impact be on your project? Would you be able to meet the Gate 2 milestones that we're proposing or not?
I guess it was specifically really, so CMP 435, which is looking at applying it retrospectively to the queue, it was specifically trying to say, well, if we do apply this retrospectively to the queue, how much of the existing queue either meets Gate 2 now or is in a position to meet Gate 2? And the answer is that the vast majority of the queue that responded to that RFI said that they would meet Gate 2 by the time that this was implemented next year. So I suppose that in itself is a slightly worrying sign that connections reform isn't going to have very much impact. There are a couple of ways to look at that, because it's worth saying that whilst the majority of transmission projects responded, I think it's less than a quarter of affected distribution projects responded to that RFI. So it was not necessarily particularly well publicised by all parties. And so you could say, well, actually, maybe the people who are most likely to proceed, the ones that responded. So, there are a couple of ways of reading that, I think. But yes, that result has been taken to the kind of regulatory group that oversees connections reform, and so which includes government and Ofgem. And I think that they have both instructed the ESO to go ahead and look at further measures of what could be done to try and reduce that queue, looking in technology limits or kind of further financial measures. And we've touched on that in another podcast that we've released recently as well. So that's probably, sort of what to look out for next.
Yeah. Okay. And then I think that's probably all we want to say really on connections reform. I guess now we're just drawing to a close on this sort of 2-year review. Some of the things coming up, looks like there's likely to be more intervention, I should say, around maybe things like technology and location within the country, around that sort of strategic spatial energy plan, SSEP. Is that right? Have I got the right acronym?
Yeah, definitely the right acronym.
Okay. So yeah, lots more sort of government level intervention there. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out and how that interacts with the connections reform and so on. I guess associated with connections reform, there's more work to come on bay allocation and bay sharing. I don't know if you've got any thoughts around that.
Yeah, again, that we probably covered that recently in Grid News and Views, but there is a draft paper that's quite positive on bay sharing. So just looking forward to the kind of publication of that and beginning to implement that from the ESO.
Yeah, then there's just sort of a few other things ticking around that's probably worth highlighting. There's some decisions for Eclipse, who are looking to have the first independent transmission operator license awarded. They've sort of been looking to apply for transmission licenses. It would be really interesting to see where Ofgem takes that and whether Eclipse are able to get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think given all of the resource constraints, it would be hard to argue why appointing another TO is a bad thing. But yeah, so watching that with interest.
Then I think there's probably issues. I think it was mentioned a little bit earlier by you, Nikki, just around the impact on demand customers with all of the network restrictions at the moment. So demand customers have been caught up with a lot of these really long connection dates. So we've seen customers in West London and other places impacted by not able to connect more than 1 megawatt, or having some other long connection dates and so on. So it'd be really interesting to see what happens with those sort of demand connections. because I think at the moment, demand customers as a collective aren't aware of these transmission issues or aren't as aware of transmission issues as generation customers.
Yeah, and are potentially sort of fairly fundamentally underrepresented in a lot of the forums where these changes are being discussed.
Yeah. Then there's various sort of regional energy strategies coming forward. Further work to go on SGT charging. We'll keep banging the drum on that one, I'm sure. And then the sort of new government, Labour government's overarching clean power by 2030 drive, how they want to try and push that forward. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, and I think the only last point from me was just that actually we are coming up to that, although it seems like a long way away, 2028 is the start of things like the next transmission regulatory framework, so RIIO-T3, and we've got ED3 coming up after that. So DNOs and TOs putting together their kind of spend profiles and their plans for reinforcement.
So I think that probably concludes our run through the last couple of years. It's been a really busy couple of years. Lots of significant changes have happened that are setting the groundwork for forthcoming years. Be interesting to see what happens in the rest of 2024 and into 2025.
Yeah.
But we hope this has been useful. It's been good for us to go back over the last couple of years and see what's happened. Just let us know your comments at some point. If you want us to cover anything else on this podcast, please let us know and we'll endeavour to do so. But for now, goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for taking your precious time to listen to this episode. Now, not everyone is ready to have a connectologist in their life. For others, it's just too expensive. And as our team is so small, we do have to be very selective in what work we take on. And that's why we put so much effort into these shows. We want our society to have the equitable energy system it needs in order to decarbonise and to thrive. So we want to help to topple as many connections barriers as we possibly can, in spite of our size. So please do feel free to ping a link to this episode to anyone you know who might be interested, because it would mean so much to everyone.